The wind howled on the battlefield and carried drops of blood and remains of the battle participants across the wasteland. The huge monster roared, opening its fetid mouth, armed with countless fangs, pointing menacingly forward. John screamed, and grabbing his blade, rushed towards the monster who wanted his death. Without understanding how, he stabbed the monster's blade right into the roof of his mouth, causing him to freeze in bewilderment. The man turned the knife, getting to the very throat of the creature, causing it to wheeze and choke on blood. His hands began to shake as he realized that they were elbow-deep in the mouth of a monster, which could close its jaws at any moment. John pulled out the blade and fell, realizing that the monster was dead. He looked at the corpse and realized that he was finally able to kill the demon with his own hands. However, in a moment of inspiration, a disgruntled voice shouted at him, calling the man unawakened. Looking up, John saw those who defeat monsters much stronger and more dangerous than the one he killed himself. The disgruntled guy shouted at him again. He was angry that John was not doing the work entrusted to him, collecting items from the corpses of demons. The main character, waking up, timidly apologizes to the man, clutching the straps of his backpack in excitement. He calls John and all the porters useless and arrogantly leaves, following his friend. Our hero frowns and looks after those who are higher in rank with longing. He follows them with his gaze and looks to where the fierce fights are taking place. Demons of various ranks and sizes, freed after the opening of the abyss, go straight towards people. The brave souls are called awakened. They appeared at the same time when the abyss opened and were called upon to fight monsters. And the main character is one of those who never awakened and has no strength. He is lower in rank and is needed on the battlefield only to carry and collect useful items from killed monsters. The man rips the valuable stone from the monster's chest with his bare hands, doing his job. Looking at the artifact with bitterness, he realizes that he never woke up to his 35 years and was unable to achieve anything. Having collected everything in his backpack, John turns to his senior ranks to notify them of the completed work, but breaks off mid-sentence. And looking to where the battle had just thundered, he froze from the horror that enveloped him. In front of him, he sees a pile of awakened bodies that fought just a minute ago. Their corpses, stained with blood, are randomly scattered and twisted. At this moment, the main character hears a terrible, guttural voice whispering that he is left alone. John sees in front of him a huge demon with horns and 6 arms. There is no mouth on his face. There are only eyes that exude death to all living things. The demon is called Asmodeus. Our hero rushes at him, putting forward his tiny blade compared to the monster. But at this moment, the demon hits John on the hand, defending himself from the blow and making the man dumbfounded. Having fallen, the main character screams in pain and grabs his bleeding elbow. Everything below him is torn off. Angrily, John, holding back his tears, turns around and looks with hatred at the one who just deprived him of his hand. At this moment, lightning falls from the creature's hands, hitting the man directly on the forehead, making him smile in bewilderment. However, looking at his killer, the main character comes to a bitter awareness of his own mortality. Blood is gushing from his head, and tears are pouring from his eyes. The man understands that this moment is the last in his life. Life flashes before John's eyes. A car accident that took the lives of his parents, bullying at school. He is angry that he will die like this, a porter, a loser vegetating in the shadows. But suddenly, a golden staircase leading straight from heaven opens to the man's gaze. John hears that the conditions for awakening have been met, and does not believe his own ears, frozen in bewilderment. He turns around, not thinking that the monster stopped and killed him. The man sees from the side his own dead body lying at the feet of the demon in a pool of blood. A strange silhouette comes down the stairs behind John and taunts the man who so naively trusted that Asmodeus would not kill him. He turns towards the voice and asks the silhouette who he is, still in shock. He evades the answer, saying only that some call him king and he must grant John power. The man looks at him, trying to comprehend what he heard, and thinking that he was the one who stopped Asmodeus. Suddenly, he again hears a mocking tone that asks the man not to be so naive, as if he had read the thoughts of the main character. A white silhouette, calling itself the king, tells John that it recognized his tenacity and chose him. The man, in bewilderment, screams to find out what this means and why he was chosen. The king again avoids answering and, mocking the main character, asks him to wait. John does not understand what is happening and tries to comprehend what he heard, not realizing the whole situation. At this very moment, a demon flies right at him and the king, with terrible speed, its mouth open. Suddenly, the main character realizes that he cannot wake up, and familiar voices reach his ears. One of them belongs to Tom. Making an effort and opening his eyes slightly, he sees the guys who humiliated him at school. Thomas, the main bully, backhands John on the cheek, causing him to wake up and burst into laughter. The redhead grabs the main character by the shirt. 2 friends behind him grin, clearly pleased with what is happening. John tries to figure out why he's back in school, and why he's 19 again, not even noticing that his bully keeps slapping him across the cheek. However, the guy still returns to the realization and memory that the White King chose him. Suddenly, the main character notices an awakening window, assigning him an F rank and a predator skill. The moment of realization makes John grin and laugh. Tom freezes, still holding his hand in the air, and does not understand why his whipping boy suddenly started laughing. Red throws the main character away, thinking that he has gone crazy from frequent beatings. The leader gets angry and shouts that John is only provoking him, but does not even notice the fist heading straight for his face. Putting all his strength into his left hand, the main character hits Thomas on the cheek with his knuckles. A powerful hook knocks the bully out and throws him a couple of meters back, right between his friends, who do not understand what is happening. At this moment, the realization that John is truly awakened brings tears to his eyes. All three freeze in shock, and Thomas continues to lie prone, struck by the blow. The protagonist's face hardens and he wipes his cheek, wet from tears, with his fist. At this moment, the bully's friends rush at John. One has flames coming out of his hand, and the other has ice. The guy deftly dodges the fiery blow, ducking under his arm. The next moment, he delivers an uppercut right to the bully's jaw, forcing him off the ground. With his right foot, John hits the icy one right in the stomach and also throws him away. The main character remembers how all his life he tried and did everything he could to increase his rank and become awakened. He remembers studying all the information he had about monsters and the abyss. He remembers how he improved physically and mastered the skills of different types of wrestling. Therefore, John knows that he will definitely not lose to people like these non-entities and continues to strike at them. The guy beats them until they both fall to the ground, exhausted and unconscious. The main character is inspired, knowing that now he can do everything, although he will have to train again. However, a sudden noise behind him makes him turn around sharply. Thomas stood up and was already wiping the blood from his face, and growths like boulders protruded from his back. The redhead's skin almost completely looks like rock. His eyes glow red. He intends to kill John. The bully throws a punch at the protagonist, but he dodges the stone fist. Time after time, the main character successfully eludes the enemy's deadly attacks. But Thomas flies up, right over John's head, and comes at him like a cannonball. When he lands, he throws up a column of dust, dirt, and stones into the air, leaving a crater at the site of his jump. The redhead squints, trying to see John in the chaos. However, he is already behind him, ready to deal a crushing blow to the offender. At this moment, the stone one turns around and also points his fist toward the main character. Although he misses, only now John realizes that everything could not be so simple. Thomas smirks, looking at the guy and his bloody fist, which landed exactly on the stone growth on the redhead's face. John realizes that he only hurt himself, and the bully punches him sharply in the stomach. From a powerful blow, the main character flies away, as if he had no weight at all. He lands with such force that his back plows a couple of meters of paving slabs. Lying in the blood, John tries to catch his breath and come to his senses, looking at his offender with annoyance. Thomas mocks the main character and walks towards him with an arrogant look. Smiling, the stone one calls John a non-entity and does not believe that he was finally able to awaken. Collecting his thoughts, the main character lies and silently listens to everything that Thomas says about him. Thinks about why he received the lowest rank and why he got this unknown skill of a predator. However, some force forces John to rise, a strange blood-red glow emanating from his body. He stands up, somehow knowing for sure that he will not lose, red lights pulsating around him and a strange purple haze. A vortex of red fire swirls around the protagonist, leaving Thomas frozen in surprise. Suddenly, he still realizes that John has really awakened with an unknown power that frightens the redhead. The main character feels how magic oozes through him, how she listens to him and succumbs to any action. His eyes turn red and emit crimson lights. He is calm and collected. Stone rushes at John with renewed vigor, directing a powerful attack at the guy. However, he blocks the blow with just one hand, forcing Thomas to stop. Red screams, not understanding what is happening, and sees a bright flash that separates him from John. The magic embedded in the stone's blow swirls around the protagonist's blocking hand. The flash becomes more powerful, and John intensifies the swirls around him and Thomas. Suddenly, magic begins to ooze straight from the stone man's chest, causing him to scream. At this time, everyone at school is going about their own business, not even knowing what battle is happening behind them. And then the sky lights up with a bright crimson tornado, landing right on the place where John and Thomas fought. The main character stands on his feet, still holding his blocking hand in front of him, and the stone one is completely exhausted, as if all the life force had been sucked out of him. Thomas falls at the feet of the protagonist with a loud sound, unable to do anything else. A pop-up window appears behind John indicating that the devouring is complete. As a result of the absorption, the protagonist's rank increased to level E, and his hand became covered with stone growths. This is because he is now the owner of Thomas's stone skin skill. Even though it was evening, the school infirmary was still open and awaiting visitors. There was only one nurse left in the office, frozen in surprise when she saw the guys. John brought all three of them into the infirmary to be treated and greeted them awkwardly. Out of surprise, the nurse screamed, asking what happened to the guys. The bullies needed thorough help, which took more than one day. The woman came out as the main character with her healing skills, which formed a light green field. The nurse again asked about the reasons for all these injuries, and John could not find anything better than to answer that they fell down the stairs. The main character was in high spirits. Not only had he awakened, but he was also able to get even with his offenders. The only thing he didn't understand was the skill of a predator. Why he, having the lowest rank, was so strong. Not only was his rank clearly stronger than F rank and comparable in strength to C rank, but he was also able to raise it in the first fight, having also acquired the enemy's skill. Thinking about why the king endowed him with such power, John did not even notice how he was already climbing the familiar stairs. Looking at the house in which he once lived, he firmly decided that he must find out more about the predator. The main character smiled, looking at the familiar place, remembering how long he had not been here. After the death of his parents, he was hospitably received by his uncle, along with his family. Remembering that the man usually returned late from work, John decided it was time to look for information about his skill. But suddenly, he heard a noise coming from his cousin Arthur's room. Looking there, he saw the youngest on his knees, and behind him 3 people. 2 of them were wearing masks, and 1 without, clearly the main one. Arthur was dumbfounded that John returned from school at that exact moment. Seeing his cousin, the main character did not understand why his cousin was not at school, and was crawling on his knees on the floor. An overturned box lying on the floor in which the relatives kept all their savings caught his eye. John remembered that Arthur dreamed of making friends with bandits, and one day ran away from home, taking his father's money with him. The main character could not even think that this happened today. The leader moved towards John and told him to forget about the situation if he did not want to get hurt. He approached the main character, looking down at him arrogantly and placing his hand on his head. John grinned, realizing that this was another chance to test the skill he had inherited in action. The long-haired man didn't even have time to understand how quickly the protagonist's fist was approaching his face. With a powerful blow, John knocked the leader off his feet, thereby slamming him into the floor. The 2 thugs and Arthur froze in surprise and could not understand what was happening. John sharply reduced the distance and approached the gang leader with the intention of testing the predator. The long-haired man, trying to dodge, shouted and asked the main character to stop. However, he was already in the leader's face, putting his hand forward, full of determination. John froze and waited for what would happen and how exactly his skill would manifest itself. But a pop-up window notified him that the predator function was not available at the moment. The long-haired man was still lying on his back, looking at John and not understanding what he wanted to do. The main character froze, trying to understand why his skill was not activated. He did not notice how the elbow of the leader, who was not going to give up, flew into his face with powerful force. With a scream, the long-haired man unleashed an attack on John, landing squarely on the jaw. The main character fell on his back with a cough, not having time to regroup or defend himself. At this moment, the leader had already jumped to his feet. His assistants were standing behind him. Everyone was ready to kill John. The smaller one had a C-rank chain skill and red-colored shackles burst out of his hands. And the thug had the ability to poison, and it seeped out of his hand in a purple puff of smoke. The leader had the skill of bleeding and released lightning bolts from his hands that looked like green thorns. All 3 attacks were aimed directly at John, who somehow managed to get to his feet by this time. A deafening explosion was heard in the house, causing the pots on the roof to jump and the antenna to shake. The room was filled with smoke and a variety of colors from the mixing of 3 different techniques. All the gang members were sure that John was dead, and the leader said that such a non-entity could not pretend to be awakened. However, at that moment, he saw a silhouette in the haze, and a wake-up window pop up stating that the use of skills had been detected. On the next window it was written that the chain, poison, and bleed skills were confirmed and successfully learned. John smiled and did not understand why the predator did not work at first, and then absorbed the blow. Still not fully understanding what was happening, he rushed at the head of the gang. With a strong blow from his stone fist, he again slammed the long-haired man into the floor, knocking him out. Having dealt with the whole gang, he realized 2 things. First, the status window could only be seen by the awakened. It reflected all the information about the owner. Second, His passive predator effect was not included in this description. The predator, in addition to absorbing someone else's power, also had the effect of neutralizing the negative consequences of techniques. John thought that only gradually would he be able to reveal the full essence of the skill he had inherited. At that very moment, Arthur threw himself on his knees right at the feet of the protagonist. The younger one raised his head and shouted that he repented of what he had done, having seen John's strong side. He shouted that he was ready to do whatever the elder ordered him, from licking his feet to barking. While John was wondering what to do with his cunning cousin, he began to bark like a dog. The main character did not care about Arthur's behavior. He was much more worried about what was about to happen. And while our hero was thinking, his cousin still continued to bark, trying his best. Then John said that he would forgive him on the condition that Arthur would go with him. The old enterprise was fenced, and there was a sign on the gate stating that only authorized persons had the right to enter the territory. The three agents stood looking at the problem they had to solve. Directly in front of them was a breach of the Abyss Gate, swarming with a variety of monsters who wanted them dead. The leader of the group, Sam, said that the last breakthrough of the gates of the Abyss was 10 years ago, and now he appeared here, and the demons began to creep away. His ward said that if nothing is done, then there is nothing left before the tragedy, and it is worth evacuating the surrounding areas. Sam assured them that nothing bad should happen, since his barrier skill was level B, and the level of the monsters in the portal was only C, and he could hold them back. One of the demons hit the barrier with his head, stretching it with all his might. The leader was still continuing his explanation about how the most powerful creature in the portal could only be no stronger than a C rank, when the barrier behind him collapsed and the monsters rushed towards him. Turning around, Sam attacked one of the demons that had already approached him with a powerful blow. Even while attacking the creature, he still did not stop his monologue. John and Arthur ran headlong down the street, straight to the place where the gates of the Abyss had broken through. The monsters that emerged from the Abyss were defeated and lay in a pile of ugly bodies. Sam examined the bodies and did not understand how these low-rank demons were able to break through his B-rank barrier. He heard a grinding noise coming from the gate and turned sharply in its direction. More and more monsters were again seeping into the barrier, trying to break through it. Suddenly, something appeared there that, according to agent practice, should not be there. All three froze, looking in horror at the pile of monsters that had piled up on the barrier. With a loud roar, one of the demons broke through the defenses again. From the collapsed barrier, new hordes of creatures crawled, wishing death to all living things. The monster that broke through the defense was an A-rank ogre giant, which was higher than all three agents combined. Sam came to the realization that this was by no means the C rank that they were notified about when they were sent on the mission. At that moment, a loud explosion was heard in the production area, breaking all the windows in the area. John and Arthur continued to run to this place. The younger did not understand how his cousin knew about the disaster that was about to happen, and he could not explain to him that he had already experienced it. Therefore, the main character could not find anything better than to lie and say that his intuition just worked. As they approached the designated location, they saw a crowd trying to escape the monsters. Arthur was dumbfounded, and John asked him to do what they agreed on the way. When Arthur asked what he would do, the main character replied that he would deal with these creatures. Full of determination, he turned into stone skin and headed towards the very center, infested with monsters. At this moment, the man standing at the window said that the situation was really so bad that the one who broke through the C-rank gate turned out to be an A rank. He turned around and said pleadingly that the only solution to this problem could be an A rank awakened. The man turned to the guy standing behind and asked him for help. It was Madness Blade Jack Travis. He was an A rank awakened. But there was one peculiarity about him, namely 8th grader syndrome, whatever that means. John killed one monster after another using his stone skin skill and his fists like cobblestones. He swirled magic around himself, thereby absorbing the power of defeated enemies. John realized that last time the Predator did not activate because of his fatigue, but now he was full of strength. Most skills require mana to use, however. This is not the only important element. If the magician gets tired, then regardless of the amount of mana, his strength weakens and eventually dries out completely. Another important point was that John can restore mana by absorbing the bodies of monsters.
As a result of the battle, the main character raised his rank to level D, which he was incredibly happy about.
He thought that at this rate he could become an awakened SS rank, and may be the first person in history to possess the SSS rank. Interrupting his daydreaming, John remembered that he needed to return to Arthur. However, right in front of him, the main character saw another awakened one fighting with a huge ogre of rank A. In his hands was a glowing blade, and the awakened one himself shouted insults and said that he would avenge the souls of the killed. He cried and shouted that he would bring a fair trial to this monster. John found this scene strange and felt Spanish shame for his comrade. Blow after blow, the awakened one attacked the ogre, bleeding with something purple. Then there was a deafening explosion, and yellow sparks rushed into the sky. John did not understand what was happening, and whether that strange man was even alive. He then remembered that this must be the same A-rank awakened one, who was supposed to resolve this crisis in his past life. Looking at it, John realized that this was indeed the Blade of Madness Jack Travis, and that it was truly as strong as they said it was. And apparently he was as stupid as other awakened people described him. Suddenly, Jack clasped his hands in prayer and began to repeat that the people of this area would be at peace. However, in John's past life, he should have been in a different place and fighting an ogre in another part of the city. The next moment, the main character felt that someone else was using the skill. A madman appeared out of nowhere and pierced Jack right through with his blade from behind. He shouted that the awakened A-rank had finally fallen into his clutches. At this time, Arthur stood and looked at the nurse sleeping peacefully right in front of him on the sofa. He was confused and did not understand whether it was even normal for him to be in the same room with this woman. On the way to the Enterprise, John explained to the younger that many people would die today, and one of them was Nurse Miriam Lance. She must die because she will be helping wounded residents right at the epicenter of the disaster. John asked Arthur to put her to sleep with his sleep skill and evacuate her away from this place. Therefore, the boy stood next to the nurse and wondered how the elder knew about all this. Suddenly, a bright realization pierced his consciousness, causing him to open his eyes wide. He decided that his cousin had the skill of foresight and therefore knew about everything that was about to happen. John looked at the picture unfolding right in front of him and clearly understood that something was clearly going wrong. Jack turned to face the madman, still standing and holding his wounded stomach. He asked who was standing in front of him and demanded that the stranger reveal himself. The madman was amazed that Jack was able to survive even with wounds that affected vital organs. Then a nasty smile appeared on his face, and he said that it would be even more interesting. It was a B-rank villain, Emmett Green. Those awakened ones who have committed crimes are called villains. John recognized him. This man killed thousands of people during the breakthrough of the gate, but the main character was sure that in his past life, these two had never met. And at that moment, John thought that he himself could influence time in such a way as to distort it. Jack became enraged, realizing that there was a villain in front of him and began to insult him. Using his sword, he angrily rushed at the madman with the intention of killing him. However, he didn't have time to hear a loud roar coming from the side to his ears, causing confusion. Both the awakened one and the villain turned around, looking in fear at the source of the noise. The ogre screamed, having woken up from Jack's attack and intending to rise up and kill the two. He threw the uncomprehending awakened one away from him, and Emmett behind him was amazed at the monster's ability to regenerate. The ogre dealt a deafening blow right between the opponents, causing them to fly apart. The villain decided that, in this case, he would leave Jack to the monster and not interfere. He turned his attention to John, who was watching this picture from the side. With a cry that the more victims, the better, the madman rushed towards the main character. John, who had not expected such a turn of events, was taken aback by surprise. Emmett was moving closer and closer to him, sticking out his disgusting and long tongue. But at the same moment, the villain was struck down by a precise kick that landed right in his jaw. The madman slid a couple of meters back and realized that an unknown awakened person was in front of him. Rolling up his sleeves, John said the name of the villain and that he had killed many innocent people. The main character was glad that they met and was ready to use his technique on Emmett. John's stone hand and the villain's blade met in a fierce battle. The madman rushed at the main character with frantic force, trying to kill him. Again and again they fought each other, defending themselves and attacking each other with renewed vigor. John knew that the fact that Emmett's attacks weren't working on him was his chance to win the battle. However, at that moment he used his stealth skill and disappeared from the main character's sight. John concentrated all his senses on understanding where the villain was hiding. He felt a rustling behind him and sharply turned towards the source of the noise. Then he dealt a crushing blow to the place where he felt the madman was hiding. But the main character was mistaken, because Emmett was right behind him. He was smiling, rejoicing in his triumph. The next moment, the villain attacked John again, and, this time, broke through his stone defense. Blood gushed from the wound. The main character did not understand how the madman did it. All skills have weaknesses, and sooner or later, the armor weakens. Emmett circled around John, delivering more and more blows. With his next attack, the villain threw the main character back, causing him to bleed. John stood and tried to come to his senses, breathing heavily and gathering his strength. Who would have thought that the stone skin skill could have such a drawback? Stone skin does not completely block the blow, and new attacks break off pieces from it, causing it to weaken. But now John was definitely sure that he could survive in a fight with a B-rank enemy, because his abilities were much higher than D rank. At this moment, the words of the protagonist that it was time to finish the tests left Emmett confused, and he again rushed at such a self-confident victim in order to finish her off and be done with it. John was glad to meet this villain because he had long wanted to take the stealth skill for himself. Emmett froze. He had never seen such ominous mana as came from his opponent. The villain again used his stealth technique and began circling John, preventing himself from being noticed. The main character began to use his predator skill, because everyone has their weaknesses. While still fighting the monsters of the abyss, he realized that even when the enemy disappeared from his field of vision, sooner or later the predator would still overtake the opponent. Therefore, no matter where Emmett was hiding now, he could not escape the power of the predator. John was confident that he could catch the villain, because the predator was very strong. Jack lay head down in the place where they had just fought with the giant ogre. He could not believe that even a hero like him was also mortal, and his last moment had come. The monster towered over him. The ogre's eyes glowed bright red, and steam came from its mouth. The next moment, he dealt a crushing blow right to the place where the exhausted Jack lay. However, the place where the crater formed after such a strong attack was empty. John used stealth techniques and pulled Jack out of the attack at the last moment. The main character realized that now, with such a skill, it would be much easier to fight. The stunned uncle and his wife met the guys right at the doorstep. They were very scared. John and Arthur awkwardly greeted them and announced that they had returned home. The relatives could not hold back their tears because they thought that the boys were killed by monsters. Soon all the news was talking about a new breakthrough of the abyss 10 years after the last one. The news showed wounded agents, and even there, Sam still couldn't understand why the gate turned out to be A rank. The police questioned Miriam, and she tried to explain to them that she passed out and woke up at home. All the laurels of the victorious ogre went to Jack, even though he frantically tried to prove to journalists that it was not he who saved the city. John was pleased that not a word was said about him in the news. It was of no use. The main character stood on the old railway, right in front of the entrance to a dark and abandoned tunnel. He was ready for the next step, leveling up because even with 3 skills, using them at a low rank would be problematic. John firmly understood that only potions could help him in this matter. A variety of elixirs were sold in their world. Some restored mana, while others, for example, restored fatigue. However, buying potions required money, and that's why our hero came to this dungeon. He needed to hunt, but using his skills without special permission was prohibited. So John decided to explore the dangerous, unexplored dungeons to collect artifacts. 3 rank B spider sisters met him and decided that they could have a feast for themselves. John was disappointed that they had such a low rank, and realized that to raise his own, he would have to kill 100 of them. The main character said all this out loud, which enraged the spiders, and they rushed to attack. They drew their paralyzing poison into their mouths to unleash it on John. A pillar of bright purple color rushed straight at the main character. However, he didn't even move. The sisters began to mock him, asking how John was feeling and whether he was paralyzed. However, the predator's skill worked again and completely neutralized the effect of the spider venom. The sisters were shocked to see this, and the fact that the main character absorbed their skill, calling it useful. Screams and sounds of struggle could be heard from the dungeon, and a pop-up status window notified John that the paralysis skill had been registered. The huge doors to the Players' Association were guarded by 2 surly men. There was a deputy manager there, a personnel officer, Espen Klaus, and he had guests. Awakened ones who were allowed to use their skills for various purposes were called players. And now there were 5 such centers to manage them. The first consisted of fighters, and they were called indivisible. In the second, there were masters. They excelled in alchemy. This concerned potions and other things like that. In the third, magicians were assigned, and they were called wizards. In the fourth, informants were masters of surveillance and were called night tramps. Well, the fifth is the authorized agency that manages the players and the other 4 centers. And Espen was confused, because a completely unexpected guest was sitting right in front of him. It was the charming head of the Night Tramp Guild S rank, Karen Katz. On the other side of the personnel officer was the chairman of the New Players Association, Gilbert Graham, also S rank. In addition to the 5 listed, there was also a guild of villains, founded by the most notorious criminals. Karen Katz brought information about them for Gilbert, who asked her about it in advance. However, the head of the Guild of Nightwalkers understood that she was called not only to hand over documents, and asked the chairman about this. He was amazed by her insight and smiled, deciding not to avoid the question. Gilbert asked Karen directly when she took the player test to get her permit, and she replied that she was 19 years old. And then, smiling again, the chairman asked if the high school student could fight the monster. John was still sitting in the same dungeon on a mountain of corpses and with a backpack full of artifacts. Leaning on the skull of one of the monsters, he dialed a number and put the phone to his ear. He called one of the 4 alchemy guilds and nonchalantly mentioned his desire to buy a couple of potions from them. 7 days after the abyss broke through, the school doors reopened to students and classes continued. John has been training hard all this week, building up his strength and endurance. However, in addition to physical activity, the main character was also engaged in clearing countless dungeons. The Alchemy Guild was stunned by how many magic stones John was able to bring them, but even raising the rank to level C did not inspire the main character, because he understood how much work was still ahead.
In addition, now he also had to go to school, where he now sat at his desk and thoughtfully looked out the window.
His classmates crowded around him and bombarded him with questions about how he managed to defeat Thomas and his gang. One of the guys warned the hero that he was now in big trouble. After all, James Craig himself, who was now sitting in front of him with his feet on the desk, found out about the incident. He was the leader of the school's gang of bullies, from a wealthy family, and had an S rank. Also, James was a member of a large corporation that sponsored their school. But the most important thing was that it was he who was the culprit of persecuting John simply because he was unawakened. James called the main character Buddy, starting a conversation, which caused misunderstanding in the second one. John was furious and told Craig to stop talking nonsense. With these words, he outraged one of James's henchmen, who began to shout at him. However, the leader's fist forced him to close his mouth, flying straight into the guy's face. He fell, and James was unhappy that his subordinate had intruded on their conversation. Craig turned to John and a flame erupted behind him, and his eye glowed red. The main character was stunned by how powerful an S-rank awakened one was. He wondered how a predator would behave in a fight with such an opponent. But at that moment, a blue-haired girl burst into the classroom and demanded that they stop. She approached James. A blue cold glow emanated from her, and she covered the hand of one of Craig's subordinates with ice. It was Allison Height, an S-class awakened and part-time prefect who was predicted to be a future SS-level player. And then James said that there was a misunderstanding. They were just having a friendly conversation. To which Allison responded with disbelief, pointing to the broken face of one of the guys. James started to get angry and told her not to cross the line to avoid problems. Then Allison asked Craig to drop everything and go out. There was such a powerful energy coming from these two that John thought it was time for these two to cool down. And James, turning sharply, agreed with Allison and walked towards the exit from the audience. However, turning around sharply, he shouted that Height was too naive if she believed that James would leave just like that. He had already gathered a fireball in his hand, when he was suddenly interrupted by a notification beep. The sound came from speakers hanging in the hallways and classrooms of the high school. A voice from the speaker said that the Players Association would hold a lecture in the main hall, and all students should report there immediately. James froze, listening to the announcement without even extinguishing the fire still burning in his hand. Allison was still ready to fight and motioned for Craig to join the fight, but he only grinned as he realized what this notification actually meant. He turned around and headed out of the classroom and said that they were lucky today. Allison turned to John to ask if he was okay, but he was no longer in the chair. The main character was already at the door and invited the girl to go into the main hall. Soon the whole school was gathered in the auditorium and waiting for the start of the lecture for which they had been invited. The same personnel officer of the association, Espen Klaus, was speaking from the podium. He announced that one of the reasons was an apology for breaking through the gates. However, the second and more important change was in the examinations for players. The students began to whisper, not understanding what this had to do with high school, since qualifications are only given at 19 years old. Espen announced that starting this year, the Players Association will allow even high school players to receive recommendations. This statement caused great surprise and excitement in the hall, mixed with inspiration. However, John was the only one who knew that this selection was already underway. The exam is taking place right at this very moment as Espen speaks from the podium. After all, hidden in his gaze was the skill of identifying the observer with his gaze, like an X-ray scanning everyone present. The gaze of the observer allowed one to quantify the exact number of abilities of the one was looking at. Klaus was encouraged by how much better the numbers in this room were than in other places. But among them were two of the most valuable specimens that Espen planned to get. The first was the fiery boy, James Craig, with a total of as many as 1924. The second contender was the icy Allison Height, whose score was even higher than Craig's at 23 and 35 points. At that moment, James raised his hand, attracting all the attention of the audience and the lecturer to ask a question. Espen waited questioningly for the words of the one he had just been thinking about and hoped that this was just a coincidence. And then Craig asked a question about whether there might be those who are not suitable for the exam, to which Klaus asked what he meant. And then James, looking at John, said that the unawakened do not need to be in this audience, because there is no useful information for them. A player's strength rests not only on his rank, but also on his ability to cope with various situations and knowledge of the abyss, for example. And in order to become one of them, the skills of the awakened must be tested. James Craig was still mocking John, declaring publicly that the unawakened could be damaged mentally by being present in this room. The main character understood that the purpose of this speech was the desire of the offender to check whether he was awakened. Then Allison intervened in the conversation, asking Craig to immediately shut his mouth. But John pulled her back, saying that he had not asked for her help, and she turned away in shame. Meanwhile, even Height's intervention did not force James to stop his attacks. John looked at him with his hands in his pockets, clearly annoyed by his opponent's behavior. However, he knew that to receive a recommendation, he did not need to prove anything to anyone personally, because they were already looking at him. Espen noticed that now there were not 2, but 3 applicants he was interested in. Klaus looked at James and realized with bitterness that even though he had a high rank, he was just a bully. And then his attention was attracted by the guy who had been being attacked by Craig for the last few minutes. Espen used his technique but couldn't read John's total. It was incredible. At this very moment, the mysterious young man raised his voice, responding to the abuse of the offender. He said that James was right and he really shouldn't be here, and, making an obscene gesture, said that he was leaving. Such boorish behavior made Craig's face twist in bewilderment. Espen still didn't understand why his gaze didn't work, because before that he could read the number of literally everyone, no matter how high his rank was. He looked at John's back and tried to use his technique over and over again, but nothing worked. At that moment, the young man turned around, looking straight at the lecturer, and smiled faintly. Espen was so amazed by this young man that he looked at him with all his eyes. And then he saw the White King behind John in the level of the guy himself, 5096. The main character was sitting in the school library and looking for evidence about who gave him the rank. Then 3 of Craig's henchmen approached him, who were clearly unpleasant about the upcoming conversation. One of them said that James was looking for John, and asked him to come with them, to which the main character smiled, turning the page, and said that he didn't want to. But then the bandit said that his aunt's restaurant might get into trouble if he didn't obey. The bully looked down on John and continued to threaten problems, not forgetting to mention that the main character has no parents. However, the guy interrupted the bandit with a precise and powerful blow right in the face. There was an explosion, knocking out the doors of the library with a crash. Everything in the office was turned over. The bookcases were broken and lay on the floor, and the books were piled in a shapeless heap right on the floor. John lifted the bandit above him by the throat and demanded that he tell him where Craig was. James was waiting for the main character in the high school gym, along with his bodyguard. He used the level-lowering skill on John, but it didn't want to work, and the guard didn't understand why. Craig grinned at the main character and began the conversation as if they were old friends. John was clearly uncomfortable with this tone and silently listened to everything his enemy said. James's bodyguard was William Killigan, an A-rank hunter. Craig made John an unexpected offer, offering to join the ranks of his future corporation. Because he didn't need losers like Thomas, he needed a genius like John. James said that if the protagonist forgets past grievances, he will achieve fame, success, and wealth. He would have continued his speech further if John had not interrupted him, again calling his words nonsense. The main character was not interested in everything that Craig was talking about, and his skin began to acquire a stone shell. His hands also plunged into powerful armor, and he said that James had crossed the line. Craig was dumbfounded, clearly not ready to refuse someone like John. Flames flared up around him, and he said that dogs like the main character need to be shown their place. At this time, Killigan placed both hands on the gym floor, forming a kind of magic circle. He used the barrier shield skill to prevent anyone outside from noticing what was happening inside. William dusted off his palms and said that this way no one would notice the battle and turned towards the schoolchildren. He did not expect that the fight had already begun, and the two were flying around the hall, striking each other. The guys continued to fight, and their forces converged and diverged, forming bright flashes. James dealt a crushing blow to the main character, which resulted in an explosion. The flash knocked John back, and a spray of bright red blood sprayed from his mouth. James was inspired by his small victory and laughed. Looking at the main character, the bodyguard watched the fight. He felt sorry for the guy who had become a whipping doll in the hands of Craig. Suddenly, John appeared again from behind the flash flame and rushed at James with an attack. However, William still understood that this kid had no chance against S rank. But suddenly something happened that made him change his mind and freeze in amazement. John took the initiative and went from defense to offense, forcing Craig to back away and defend. And unexpectedly, the main character hit James with his stone fist right in the face. Craig flew back, throwing up a heap of dust and splinters from the gym floor. The bodyguard didn't understand how it was possible that John had thrown James away from him. Craig lay supine in a pile of broken boards, trying to catch his breath and regain his composure. He screamed that he couldn't move and didn't understand what was happening to him. John stood covered in blood, but smiled, folding his hand in a triumphant gesture, because he had finally managed to combine several skills together. Of course, his C-rank paralysis skill could not penetrate such a strong S-rank defense. Therefore, the main character, with his blows, accumulated paralysis in the opponent's body, causing him to become numb. And now, while the defeated James Craig lay immobilized on the floor, John slowly approached him. Killigan looked at this young man with obvious confusion as to how he managed to defeat his boss in direct confrontation. Lying on the floor, Craig admitted that he had completely underestimated his opponent. He took out a small purple gem and held it right in front of him. The next moment, he crushed it with his fingers, saying that he would now fight with full force. At that same second, a huge fiery skeleton, the height of a multi-story building, appeared in front of John. James controlled it, being inside, as if in a shell and half burning himself. John turned around and began to run away from the monster, not finding the best tactics in this situation. Behind him, the fiery fist of a monster was already approaching him, carrying death and hellish power. The main character managed to jump away and the monster missed. The next moment, he roared wildly, spewing out a pillar of bright flame from his mouth. As he jumped, John aimed his fiery fist at the beast's face, passing straight through the fireball. However, the C-rank armor could not withstand the heat of this flame and began to fall off, exposing the skin. The main character was thrown back, and the armor quickly disappeared and burned in the fire. John fell, completely unprotected, his back sliding along the floor, his skin burning. The monster is the embodiment of Craig's skill, namely the true form of the fiery heart. The artifact that James used was nothing more than a magical enhancement stone. The heart of a monster. William, looking at this picture, realized what was going on and that it was time to stop the fight. He shouted to his boss, asking him to stop and not kill the innocent youth. At that moment, Craig unleashed a furious blow on his bodyguard, who had allowed himself such insolence. He was still burning and looked little like a man. Anger enveloped him and endowed him with monstrous strength. While James was distracted by his subordinate, the main character had already risen to his feet. However, a hellishly powerful and therefore deadly wave of fire fell directly on John. Craig was on the verge of madness. He laughed hysterically and told the main character to die. At the site where the impact occurred, there was a deep crater that pierced the floor and part of the foundation of the school. William rushed to the pit, holding out his hand to pull John out and help him escape from the distraught James. But the one who was in the crater sharply hit the bodyguard in the face with his fist, with such force that the man started bleeding from his mouth and flew a couple of meters away. In a puff of smoke from the funnel, the silhouette of the protagonist, who had risen to his feet, appeared. He said that now he would also fight at full strength, because he had already emptied a couple of vials of potions. John released the predator, and it enveloped him in ominous red mana. Espen Klaus stood directly in front of the chairman of the Players' Academy and reported on the meeting at the school. Gilbert Graham was stunned by the performances of James Craig and Allison Height. The two girls standing at the side of his table were also stunned, because these numbers reached the level of a saint. Saint was one of the Japanese huntresses whose numerical rank at the time of qualification was 2,500. But how could an ordinary high school student achieve twice the saint's numbers? Espen still could not understand what had happened and whether it was a glitch or some strange coincidence. Therefore, having assembled a commission with him, he was determined to find the guy and find out for sure. William fell to his knees and could not understand how what was happening before his eyes was even possible. John's predator wrapped itself around the fire monster and squeezed it in a death grip. James also didn't understand where such a non-entity like his enemy had such abilities. John continued using the predator and devoured the monster, not paying attention to Craig's screams. He didn't care who James's son was or what his rank was. After all, the main character had a much more valuable and impressive thing: the power of the White King. The predator's tentacles, having destroyed the fire monster, headed straight towards Craig, who was frozen in bewilderment. They hit him with such force that a blinding red and white flash pierced the gym. There was a powerful explosion that broke the windows and tore the roof of the hall. It was impossible not to notice this even being outside the barrier. The school gym building after that looked more like a nuclear testing site than part of the school. James was again lying on his back on the floor, but at this moment he was no longer just paralyzed, but unconscious. William trembled all over, looking at the young man, whose strength was so crushing that he was able to defeat his boss. John was surprised by the abilities of Craig's subordinate and glared back at him. William was between the guys, separating them from each other and breathing heavily. At the moment of the Predator's attack, the bodyguard skillfully intervened in the battle and pulled out his boss. However, this did not matter, because the Predator had already absorbed Craig's skills, and John was not going to kill him. And then the main character voiced something that the guard was not prepared for. He looked at John and couldn't believe his ears, because John said that he must now receive payment for saving Craig's life. After thinking a little about exactly how much money he should receive from the boy, the heir to such a vast corporation, he grinned. John named the amount. He demanded no more, no less, but a whole billion. The school children who gathered near the gym were shocked by what was happening there and by the destruction of the building. Among them was Allison, who felt the use of magic and strong flames. She realized that James was definitely involved in this. She believed that he was again tormenting and offending defenseless John, who had nothing to answer the bully. While the nurse tried to calm the gathered guys, Allison rushed straight into the epicenter of the explosion. She ran through the gym as fast as she could, praying that poor John would live. However, she saw the victim of the explosion not at all as the main character, but as James Craig. John stood and looked at her as if nothing had happened, although he was covered in blood. She stared at the two in confusion, trying to understand what happened and who caused the explosion. John lied that he didn't know what Craig was doing here and that he came after the explosion. Maybe he just fell down the stairs. Allison looked at James and realized that there was no smell of stairs here, and the main character asked her to take the victim to the first aid station. Height turned around sharply and demanded that John properly explain to her what happened here. However, there was no one in the place where the guy had just stood, and only Allison and James remained in the gym. John used his stealth skill and was already far from the school, watching it from the mountain road. A pop-up window notified him of new skills, and that an unexpected charm had been added to them. 5. John previously thought that this was only reserved for various kinds of celebrities, and thought that he was unlucky. However, he also got the skill of the heart of a monarch, and the main character was already incredibly happy about this. This was a very rare ability that made it possible to strengthen not only the awakened one himself, but also all members of his squad. John was very pleased, and was already heading home without even noticing the car behind him. Several identical black cars drove up to him, obviously there because of John. A dog barking reached his ears, and the main character did not understand who they were, and what they wanted from him. A group of people in identical suits got out of the cars, and among them, Espen appeared in the headlights. John did not understand what the deputy director of the academy and part-time personnel officer was doing here. Klaus approached the main character and immediately got down to business, asking what he had done at school. 7. At this time, at the Craig residence, the bodyguard was kneeling in front of James's father. William was shaking with excitement, and did not understand what this man could do to him. Craig Sr. said that the guy who beat his son was very impudent, and William should deal with this situation as quietly as possible. He also wanted to receive compensation, and wanted to teach the young man a bad lesson. William began to object to the boss, and shout that James's opponent was just a boy.
To which the man told him to shut up and not contradict him, because he did not allow the dog to bark.
James's father was Jordan Craig, an S-rank hunter and director of the very corporation that sponsored the school. Meanwhile, Espen was still waiting for an answer from John about what he had done at school. The main character did not understand what exactly was meant, an explosion in the gym or its quantitative number. Then John, deciding to find out, asked Espen a direct question about what exactly he meant. Klaus, who apparently did not care much about the explosion, reported that the fire was already being extinguished. Espen continued to press John about what he did in the school meeting room. To this, the main character replied that he was sure that the reason for their visit to the school was the desire to conduct a test with him. Espen didn't understand why they had to come to school because of someone like John. Such a statement angered the main character, and he used a predator, showing those present his power. This time, its quantitative number was even greater than last time and amounted to 5214. Espen was shocked that this was not a coincidence, and now the quantitative level is even higher. An ominous and incredibly strong energy emanated from this mysterious young man. Then Espen asked why John was standing here covered in dirt. Arthur was overjoyed that his cousin had been given a hunter test next month. In the eyes of the younger, John was now almost a god and king of all hunters. The incident in the gym had to be hushed up by members of the corporation so that no one knew about John. At that moment, the main character's phone vibrated, and none other than William Killigan called him. A bandaged hand held the throat of an A-rank hunter guarding John's house. The criminal did not understand why such an agent would waste time guarding the small fry. Then the second, his A-rank elder brother, said that this must be a rising star who will be tested soon.
The younger brother was also of rank and argued with him, believing that John was just a boy with no experience.
The elder agreed with him and said that he would be a very easy target for them. At that moment, a man appeared on the roof, holding the white man by the neck and beating him. Then the elder rushed at the stranger, asking who he was and about to attack. The stranger let go of the younger one and turned to the black one, grinning at him. With all his strength, John struck his opponent with a stone knee, slamming him right into the face. John said that he was the small fry that would be easy for them to deal with. A few hours earlier, in addition to the billion, the main character spoke about 2 more conditions included in the deal. Purple lights and chains began to ooze from his hand, causing the bodyguard to go cold. It was an oath of awakening that could not be broken, otherwise a random penalty would be imposed. The first condition was that the corporation had to do its best to hush up the incident with the gym. And indeed, all the news trumpeted that the cause of the explosion was a gas leak. The second condition was William's obligation to notify John about all the mercenaries that Jordan Craig would send. Black rushed at the main character with a blade strapped to his forearm. However, after their past rivals, these two didn't even make John break a sweat. The main character dealt a powerful blow to the place where the black one had just rushed at him, but he jumped up and was about to attack John right from behind. With a powerful blow, the elder brother kicked up a pile of dust and stones into the air. But John used a stealth technique and ended up directly on top of the black man, placing his foot on his head. The main character said that he knew in advance what skills the brothers had, but they were nothing outstanding. John's eyes became redder than before, and red lights swirled around again, a trace of the predator's use. At this time, a luxurious Rolls-Royce, the kind used by the rich and famous, was moving along the road. The passenger in this car was Karen Katz, the head of the Guild of Nightwalkers. She had a telephone conversation about how the selection for hunters had already been completed. Her interlocutor was the chairman of the academy, Gilbert Graham. They discussed who had been selected, various students from completely different schools and families, and of course, a relative of Karen herself. And then Karen decided to tell her interlocutor more interesting and intriguing news about the boy who was personally approached by Espen Klaus, having found him along with his commission. At this very moment, John's predator skill failed again, notifying him that his physical strength was not enough and an overload had occurred. The black and white brothers were tied up and promptly handed over to the agents. 2 people were animatedly discussing the fact that now this gang is causing problems not only for the academy, but also for ordinary school children. Espen thanked John for neutralizing the brothers and asked if he knew who was behind the attack. The main character looked away and lied that he didn't have the slightest idea about it. Then Klaus said that the list of test participants might be revealed and he would have to call for reinforcements. However, John was more worried not about the possibility of new attacks, but about the fact that the predator refused to work. Why then were skills needed at all if, due to lack of physical capabilities, he could not use them? By winning battles, he could no longer increase in rank because the predator was not working. Therefore, he had one option: print out his skill, and he was determined to use it. A friendly girl from the Blackhead Fitness Center named Carmen met the guys and handed them a club brochure. Arthur was amazed because John led him to the most expensive and successful hall in the city. Carmen, realizing that in front of her were ordinary school children, wanted to refuse them service. However, John handed her a gold SVIP card and asked her to register 2 people. The girl was amazed because this was an elite card of the Alchemist's Guild. She didn't understand how a schoolboy could have such a card. Was he just a relative of an influential alchemist or the owner? Looking at the guys, she couldn't decide what to do, because if she made the payment, problems could arise. And then a man appeared behind her. Literally a bearded and mohawked mountain of muscles. This was a B-rank coach, the strongest in this club, who achieved his form on his own, Bo Delray. He was famous for breaking newcomers in this gym and loved to pose and flex his muscles. With this hairstyle and beard, Bo seemed like a rooster to the main character, and he called Delray a snotty weakling. Instantly, the big man's expression changed, and he looked at John sternly. Carmen and Arthur, behind the back of the main character, were amazed at the guy's behavior. Bo asked John if he thought he was stronger than him, and then the main character offered to bet on the payment of an annual club member that he was really stronger. In amazement, Bo shouted that the boy didn't even know what he'd gotten himself into. The main character and the big guy stood on the stone road. Their images looked like holograms. The competitors sat on large chairs, immersed in some kind of program. It was a training program called Virtual Porter Training. In this virtual program, you had to carry as much weight as possible, kill as many Class B monsters as possible, and get to your destination in the shortest possible time. The signal to start sounded, and Bo immediately, pulling on a heavy backpack, rushed into battle. He put together combos, defeating one abyss monster after another, and walked towards victory. While doing all this, he said that an unsurpassed porter would make John like a first grader. However, he didn't even notice that the main character was already far ahead and was running at a higher speed. Behind his back was a backpack many times larger than Del Rey's load, and the monsters scattered like 9 pins. In a matter of minutes, the main character scored the maximum combo, securing victory. Bo was so shocked that he didn't even move from the moment he started watching John. The main character announced that the dispute was complicated, and now Del Rey must pay for his subscription. A month later, after the announcement of the test for hunters, the long-awaited day arrived, and schoolchildren from all over the country flocked to the stadium. Absolutely different, they were similar in one thing. Each of them was wildly worried before passing the test. Among them were such rising stars as A-rank Tekken, who had no equal in close combat and had iron skin. There was also a rank A druid from the Alchemist's Guild who had excellent combat sense. Also, here was the Thunderer Antonio S rank, who has no rivals in his homeland. And of course, Allison Height, an awakened Japanese saint level, was also present at the test. At this time, the E-rank reporter whined as she looked at the crowd of schoolchildren in front of her. She understood that she would not even be able to photograph celebrities, let alone interview them. Continuing to be sad, she did not even notice how another contender was approaching her from behind. He was also unhappy that so many people had gathered here and he would have to walk through the crowd. Then she rushed to the young man, begging him to give her an interview. Because of this reporter, John was almost late for the test that was about to start. But even so, he understood that he should worry about his image in advance. There were a lot of people gathered. They crowded around waiting for the test to start. Then in the crowd, Allison noticed John, who had clearly changed over the course of the month. She did not understand what happened to his body in such a short time and how he managed it. John replied that he had just practiced a little, and Allison could not believe her eyes that waking up had changed him so much. At that moment, a man appeared on all the screens in the room, greeting everyone gathered. The man in the image announced that the first stage of the test would be held in this hall. Each participant had an examination badge on his chest with a number engraved on it. According to the rules, players had to collect 5 badges, including their own, and those who lost theirs were eliminated. Suddenly, the space of the hall began to change, and the cubes under the participants' feet began to move. They announced the start of the competition, and that time would be limited. Only an hour was allotted for this stage. Allison Height, with the sudden creation of a huge block of ice, threw away the applicants flying towards her. The judges watching the competition from behind the glass were amazed by her amazing skills. One of the judges was especially watching the Thunderer Antonio, who after 20 minutes, no one could get close to. Espen Klaus was the only one who knew the real star of the evening and his scores. He watched John with all his eyes, rooting for him with all his heart, but, unexpectedly for himself, he realized that this boy was fighting with Tekken himself, which was, in his opinion, very reckless. John missed blow after blow and never dodged the attacks of the Iron One. Espen could not understand what was happening and why such a strong contender was missing so many punches. John seemed to be deliberately moving towards the enemy's fist, which came into his face over and over again. Finally, with a strong blow to the nose, Tekken threw John a couple of meters back. The point was that only training to the limit of his capabilities could increase John's level, and now he received +1 to endurance and charisma. And then the main character rushed at his opponent, striking him with one of his most powerful blows. The iron skin on Tekken's face split open, revealing it as blood gushed from his nose and mouth. The enemy fell unconscious right at the feet of the protagonist, who was pleased with this outcome. John took the badge from his opponent, and the loudspeakers announced that he now had 2 of them. Espen, who was watching what was happening, even laughed at what a brilliant move it was. It was very brave to train directly into such a large-scale battle for survival like this. But after this battle, there was a problem, which was increased fatigue. However, our hero was heading straight to the Thunderer Antonio, who had already collected 147 badges. John stood upside down in front of him and counted his badges, amazed at the number. Clenching his hand into a fist, the main character firmly decided that he would take them all for himself. Suddenly, John rushed onto the platform where Antonio was standing and kicked up a column of dust into the air. The main character missed, and now the Thunderer snapped his fingers, shooting lightning at him. Having dodged several attacks, John flew straight towards his opponent with great speed. He put his right leg, covered with stones, forward to strike at the Thunderer. However, everything could not be so simple, and a powerful discharge repelled the attack of the main character. He moved to the opposite platform to avoid the enemy's response. The main character tried to catch his breath. He did not expect that it would be so difficult for him to fight him. The powerful lightning that surrounded the Thunderer's body was an ideal weapon for short-range and close-range combat. John didn't understand how he could break through such a defense in a situation where he couldn't use a predator. And then Antonio sharply approached the main character, preparing a new wave of a powerful attack. John, although not without difficulty, managed to dodge this blow from the awakened one. The main character also walked away from the kick, still thinking about how he could win. The young people fought again in a duel in which John had no choice but to defend himself. A powerful bolt of lightning passed through the main character's body, causing him to straighten up and scream in pain. But the next moment he used a huge block of stone to bring it down on Antonio. However, this did not help. The boulder simply crumbled when it met the lightning of the Thunderer. A bright flash of white light illuminated the examination hall. John had to shield himself from the blinding rays coming from Antonio. At the same moment, the Thunderer flew into the air, preparing for another attack. John had no choice but to cross his arms and block the blow. A powerful blast wave threw him back, breaking through the block he had placed. Everyone in the hall had previously only run away from the Thunderer, trying to hide from his lightning. Antonio thought only Allison Height could entertain him at this point. At that moment, a powerful blow threw the Thunderer back, forcing him to fly into the air. None of John's attacks could affect Antonio, but he still managed to cause damage. The new attack hit Antonio in the stomach, causing him to scream and throw him back. Of course, there was no way John's stone skin could penetrate the wrath of the rain god. But the platforms of the testing hall were made of material that could withstand any techniques of the awakened ones. Therefore, it was the use of these plates that was the only way to defeat the Thunderer. And the next moment, the main character brought down a huge boulder on Antonio, slamming him deeper into the floor. The platform on which the battle took place exploded, raising a column of dust. The judges could not understand what happened there, and how the C rank could defeat the S rank. And only Espen knew that that C rank guy was actually much stronger than his opponent. John stood over Antonio and collected the victory badges while he lay unconscious. Suddenly, a huge block of ice rushed past the main character. It hit the floor right next to where John had just stood, having managed to jump away. Something like a huge snowflake appeared under the ceiling above his head. Suddenly, a huge ball of ice collapsed around the platform, blocking it. Allison Height approached John from the edge of the platform, looking frightening. The main character did not understand what she was doing here, and why she suddenly decided to attack him. He didn't understand how she did it, and Allison started saying that with great power comes responsibility. Height acknowledged the protagonist's strength, and said that she did not expect him to be able to defeat the Thunderer. John still didn't understand what she wanted from him, and asked why she suddenly started this. And at that moment she struck right at the place where the main character was standing, who managed to jump away. Allison launched an attack with snow that bombarded the entire surface of the platform. John could only run away from the bombing, because his skills, even stealth, did not work here at all. And then he didn't even notice Allison's leg, flying straight into his face and threatening to knock him out. Allison swung her boot at him while jumping, causing his opponent to grit his teeth. The snow bombing continued to attack John, knocking her back, away from Height. The main character missed blow after blow, unable to escape from them or hide anywhere. Suddenly, a huge ice peak struck the protagonist, throwing him into the air. John fell, and Allison said that he was not worthy of being a hunter because he was not qualified. He trembled as he listened to her talk about how all he did was violence. But what happened next shocked Allison. John, having made an incredible effort on himself, still stood up, even after so many attacks. The main character rose to his feet and called Height a coward and said that she just wanted to humiliate him using the test. Allison was taken aback by such words because she did not mean at all what John was talking about. And then she got angry. A huge ice staff appeared in her hands, threatening John with loss. The main character's stone armor had long since lost its strength, and the rest of his skills had no meaning at all. And then John decided to use the only thing that could work in this situation. He rushed to Allison and, knocking her down, clasped her hands and kissed her right on the lips. Height was shocked by such actions of the enemy and did not understand what he was doing. However, the purpose of this action was not a kiss, it was the use of the paralysis skill. The techniques became stronger at close range and became much more powerful when penetrating inside the opponent. Paralyzed and stunned, Allison lay on her back and could not even move. The result of the attack was a shock inflicted on the enemy's mind and an increase in charisma by 3 points. Suddenly, the now familiar voice of the man on the screen came from the loudspeakers. The sound from the speakers informed that the first stage of testing was completed. Doctors were called to the examination site to evacuate and assist the victims. Even though Allison failed the first stage and lost her badge, she still advanced to the second stage. John attracted the attention of those around him because, although he collected only 7 badges, he defeated Antonio and Height. The other exam participants were whispering behind his back and couldn't believe that this C-ranked one had defeated 2 S-ranked ones. Walking along the hospital wing, the main character thought that it would be nice for him to have a healing skill, because after the test, he could not even stand on his feet. Suddenly, a scream came from the side of his ears, attracting John's attention. The Thunderer shouted, who immediately attacked the main character while he was not looking. John barely managed to intercept Antonio's fist, not understanding what and why he was doing. The Thunderer continued his attack, shouting that the main character would not be able to perform his tricks here. The noise of the ensuing fight attracted other hospital patients, forcing them to come closer and watch. They realized that, most likely, Antonio wanted revenge for the exam and cheered for him, shouting his name, because the guys would benefit if someone like John flunked out. Then the Thunderer sent a powerful discharge towards the fans, forcing them to close their mouths. John turned to him, grinned and invited the Thunderer to fight honestly. Antonio laughed madly, full of rage at such a brazen statement. But suddenly some force fell straight from the ceiling. It pressed a multi-ton load on my shoulders. The Thunderer fell with a crash, slamming into the floor and breaking the tiles of the hospital wing. He screamed, not understanding why he was being defeated again and could not get up. The same man who explained the rules from the screens at the first test approached the guys. John was sweating, trying to stay on his feet. Although it was difficult, he knew who exactly was in front of him. It was an S-rank hunter, Robert Griffin, one of the strongest. The man was predicted to be given the SS rank. He looked at the trembling guy in front of him, barely able to stay on his feet. Robert was surprised that the young man was still standing while everyone else could not. Then a colorful ball appeared in his hand, sparkling with bright colors, and a faint gray haze emanated from it. The gravity acting on John intensified and the tiles under his feet burst. However, the guy still held on. He knew that the skills of awakened and S-rank hunters were different, but he didn't think it was that much. Robert chuckled, still surprised by the guy's skills, and said that now he would use a technique that even veterans could not withstand. The ball in his hand sparkled even brighter. It vibrated, and the waves emanating from it seemed to change space. However, to the great relief of the main character, something happened that distracted Robert. 2 doctors flew into the hospital wing, outraged by the behavior of their boss. He said that he was only disciplining the school children, but they did not believe him, saying that he wanted to expel them even before the start of the second test. Robert no longer listened to the annoying paramedics and grinned, looking at John, who was catching his breath. Griffin turned fully to the exhausted protagonist and asked his name. The guy, after a little hesitation, said that his name was, and gave his last name, Smith. Robert realized that this was the same C-rank who had defeated students stronger than himself, and smiled at the fact that something interesting had finally appeared. He patted John on the shoulder and said that his goal was probably to become an S-rank hunter, and added that he would look forward to it. In an instant, Robert was several meters behind John and heading towards the exit. However, such an elegant attempt to escape from talking with the paramedics did not work, and they rushed after him, still cursing. In the next stage, the test takers were gathered in the center of a thicket, directly in front of a large stage. Robert stood on it. He greeted the school children and asked if they had finished resting. The guys were surprised and at the same time outraged that their treatment was called rest. Griffin announced that the gate to the second location of the test was directly behind him. This door led to a D-rank dungeon with real monsters, and the school children were undoubtedly shocked by such information. Every 5 test subjects entering the gate were required to form a team under the leadership of one of the hunters, and all their skills were assessed. The necessary materials, such as weapons and consumables, were provided by the academy. John stood among the crowd of guys, carefully listening to every word of the examiner. He knew that a D-rank dungeon would be a piece of cake even for an amateur novice. However, the situation could become more complicated if this is in fact a double apocalypse dungeon. This S-rank dungeon was the first double dungeon in the world to be discovered at the D-rank level. The first group of explorers was then killed, and the survivors fled. John thought it would be good if the disaster had been prevented in advance, but no one would have believed his words anyway. Therefore, as he stepped into the portal, he decided for himself that he would simply try not to fall into the first group, and everything would go smoothly. However, the first 4 students, led by a mustachioed hunter, were already waiting for him outside the gate. He was a Class A agent with a rather elegant style, a sorcerer. John recognized him and remembered that his special characteristic was the discovery of the apocalyptic dungeon. And then the main character realized that trouble could not be avoided. Shapeless piles of monsters rushed at the students from all sides. However, the examinees were not the type to be easily frightened, and they rushed at the monsters in response. The hunter applauded the children. He was delighted with the skills of those who had not yet been in real combat. The sorcerer praised them out loud, calling their skills amazing, while clapping continuously. The guys were embarrassed, saying that he shouldn't praise them like that, and they owed it to his precise instructions. John still didn't understand how he managed to get into the top 5 when there were so many others. He noticed a ring on the hunter's finger that stood out and glittered on his finger. Without a doubt, this was the same item that the discoverer of Apocalypto wore. The Ring of the Sage, a unique artifact that increases the strength, endurance, and mana of the owner by 10 points. This was the final proof that there really was an Apocalypto in this dungeon. And although the predator was sealed, John was determined to prevent the tragedy that happened in his world. Suddenly, a fork into 2 other tunnels appeared in front of the students. The examinees could not decide where exactly to go and asked the sorcerer for advice. While he was talking about how they should vote, John rushed behind him at great speed. The main character had already chosen the path and ran straight towards it amid disapproving cries. The sorcerer was outraged and shouted that exploring the dungeon alone was dangerous. John turned around nonchalantly and called them to follow him, saying that everything was fine. He decided that he would not let them choose for themselves. He was still running through the tunnel and jumped straight into the crevice in front of him. John decided that he would not allow the discovery of the apocalypse even at the cost of his own life. But what the next moment appeared right in front of his face made the main character freeze. He stood right in front of the very portal from which strong magical energy and violet rays emanated. The students were already behind him and did not understand why there was a portal in front of them again, because they were already in the dungeon. The main character turned around sharply and ordered everyone present to remain in place. He shouted that the fact that another gate had appeared here was very strange, and they should not go there. John turned to the sorcerer and said that such incidents should be reported immediately. The hunter replied that he had seen something like this for the first time and, undoubtedly, should have reported this to headquarters. John clearly didn't like where the hunter was going and expected the worst. And then the sorcerer, with the important air of a professor, offered to enter the portal. He extended his hand to the funnel and said that the force emanating from the gate was not as dangerous as it looked. And since they have been prepared by the association, exploring the next dungeon will bring them the highest score. John said that the sorcerer had gone mad, because this was contrary to the principles of exploring the abyss. Then the professor pointed his finger at someone who was standing at a distance from the bulk of the students, and said that he clearly did not know how to work in a team. The sorcerer's statement was clearly what the disciples were thinking, because they immediately agreed with him. The main character was amazed by this development of events, and clearly did not expect accusations against him. The next moment, the school children had already gathered around the sorcerer and stood opposite John. He tried to reason with the hunter for the last time, saying that he should think again. However, the sorcerer, with a feeling of complete self-confidence, snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the light emanating from the portal changed its color and became black and white. The gate looked like a huge eye, watching over those who dared to disturb their peace.
The sorcerer transported everyone present to the apocalypse and was surprised at what he saw in front of him.
The examinees also couldn't believe that they were still in a D-rank dungeon. They stood in a huge hall, on the sides of which columns were piled, and in the center there was a strange figure that looked like a statue. She looked like a skeleton. A semblance of a distorted halo shone above her head, and the statue held a sword in her hands. The sorcerer did not understand how this could even happen in a D-rank dungeon. John stepped forward and ordered everyone to be quiet and focus on the matter at hand. Suddenly, from behind a pillar of dust, 2 silhouettes appeared, similar to a statue at the end of the hall. They looked much more sinister compared to the previous monsters. In front of the students were monsters of rank A, Death Knights. Everyone, led by the professor, froze, not understanding where such people came from here. The sorcerer turned sharply to the students and ordered them to prepare for battle. The knights drew their swords, and with wild speed asked to be examined. The sorcerer skillfully repelled their attack, which almost fell directly on the children. He released yellow sparks from his hands, using all the skills he had. Suddenly, under the feet of the knights, the floor melted, turning into magma, and they themselves were pierced by peaks that grew straight from the ground. The professor ordered everyone who has fire and other flashes to create monsters, and those who hold shields and have defensive skills had to hold the knights, not giving them distance. Led by the sorcerer, the examinees skillfully fought the monsters, while John stood aside. The Death Knights were eventually defeated and crushed. They lay on the floor. The professor was clearly pleased with the skills of his charges and was already extinguishing the fire coming from his fingers. One of the guys shouted that it was cool and that he wanted to try again without seeing what was behind him. 4 other knights were heading towards the group, carrying a variety of weapons with them. The guy who just wanted to try again turned to the monsters and screamed in fear. John bent over one of the knights and rummaged through his stomach to pick up the artifact. But what he discovered seemed impossible. It simply shouldn't have happened. The group of explorers continued the battle and killed the knights one by one. But however, one killed knight was replaced by a whole horde of his kind. But there was one more problem. The students were exhausted and mortally exhausted from such a fight. Then John walked towards them, voicing his guess that there was something strange here. Compared to the others, he looked much better, and didn't even look tired. Moreover, if it were not for his skill as the heart of a monarch, then everyone present would hardly have withstood such a long duel. The sorcerer looked at the main character, and did not understand who he was, and why he was so strong. John said that those they are fighting are not Death Knights at all. This statement shocked everyone present, and the sorcerer asked who they were then. The main character replied that he was just going to check it out, and taking the sword of one of the monsters, headed towards them. John rushed straight towards the army of Death Knights who had already drawn their weapons. They dealt a crushing and powerful blow right to the place where the main character had just been. However, under the monster's weapons there was only an empty, smoking crater. And John soared into the air and flew right over their heads. He raised his weapon and prepared for the powerful attack he was about to deliver. He pointed the sword directly at the skeleton statue that stood at the end of the pillared hall. The weapon flew straight at its target, smashing the stone head into pieces. At this moment, the monsters that were behind the main character began to disappear. The space changed and seemed to begin to crack. The sorcerer said that all this looked like an illusion. John corrected him and said that it was an illusion trap showing virtual enemies. The disciples could not believe that such a difficult battle was just an illusion. And then the professor asked how the main character knew this, because he had never fought with Death Knights. He replied that he himself did not know. But however, he was not as weak as they thought of him. These words confused the professor, because the guy was not only very strong, he was also the first to know that the dungeon was dangerous. At that moment, John turned around and called everyone to follow him, urging them to move on before they were buried here. The group continued to move through the dungeon. The professor lit the way for everyone, and John carried the wounded girl. Despite the fact that the illusion disappeared, the situation did not improve. The space of the abyss completely changed. In addition, the injuries received in battle were very serious, and the examinees could not simply wait for rescue. The only way out for them was to find a portal leading from the dungeon to the outside, and they found a huge door completely covered with images of skulls. One of the guys suggested that entering there could be dangerous, and the sorcerer agreed with him. However, it was impossible to hesitate. They would still die here without opening the door. There was one Death Knight in the hall, holding a sword in front of him and kneeling. Then the guys were inspired, because he was only here alone and seemed not dangerous. But at the same moment, another pile of the same monsters appeared behind him. All members of the group were shocked by this development of events, which clearly did not benefit them. More and more monsters marched from all sides, tongues of flame bursting out from under their swords. Torches lit up everywhere in the hall, illuminating more and more hordes of monsters. The researchers froze. They did not know what to do next, because they were surrounded by a deadly force that threatened death. Behind the knights, another one sat on the throne, much larger and more formidable than his comrades. It was the owner of the Apocalypto dungeon, an S-rank Lord Death Knight. He shouted that once they got here, the battle would begin, and the knights rattled their swords in approval. One of them raised his weapon, pointing it at the group of explorers. This gesture was familiar to John, and he said that the monster wanted a duel. Then the guys shouted that they couldn't stand it. They were too tired, and their mana had run out. The main character asked them to calm down, because the goal was not to win, but to get out of here. But the guys started running away, shouting that they just needed to go back to where they started. Then one of the monsters, who was closest to them, raised his blade. With one powerful blow, he struck those who dared to flee the battlefield. Their blood gushed into the sorcerer and John, who were dumbfounded and did not have time to really understand anything. The professor said he would buy them some time and ordered John to find a way out. He threw away the protesting protagonist and the girl he was holding on his shoulders. The sorcerer ordered John to close his mouth and said that this matter was not for low-ranking awakened ones. John stared blankly at where the professor had just stood in front of him. Suddenly, a wall grew behind the sorcerer, separating the students from the battlefield. The man said that he always wanted to become an S-rank hunter, and this is his chance. At that moment, the Death Knight rushed at him, ready to slay the sorcerer with his sword. The professor folded his hands, between which a bizarre green triangle appeared. He responded to the enemy's attack by rushing at him with a retaliatory blow. The sorcerer managed to throw the monster away from him with a powerful attack, and he stood with his hands out in front of him. John had no choice but to agree with the professor, and he turned away from the wall. But however, he realized that all the wounded were already dead, and this thought shocked him. A barrier summoned by the sorcerer suddenly collapsed behind the main character.
The main character turned around, protecting himself from the dust and fragments flying at him.
An army of Death Knights stood before him, and the sword of one was plunged into the back of the dead professor. The next moment, the monster raised his bloody blade. He pointed them at the main character, clearly challenging him to a duel. The next moment, John noticed the sage's ring flying off the sorcerer's finger. This was his chance. The Death Knight raised his blade, preparing a deadly attack on the enemy. However, John skillfully dodged the weapon and rushed to the side, grabbing the ring. Putting it on his finger, the protagonist prayed that his plan would work. The monsters were already around John. They threatened him with death, but red sparks burst out of the guy's hands. The next moment, a loud explosion sounded, shattering the stone knights into pieces. The Lord looked at this and did not understand what was happening there, and how the boy could pull this off. The awakened window notified the main character that the sage's ring was activated, and all abilities were increased by 10. But the main thing was that all the conditions were met, and the seal of the predator finally succumbed and fell.